This is breaking news from DawgNation.
Hello, DawgNation. Welcome into our Tuesday night coverage of the latest release of the College Football Playoff Top 25. This one coming out a bit later than most of the weekly rankings do, and I think plenty to talk about here from what we just saw with Georgia ranked number 12 by the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. I've got Connor Riley on hand. Looks like he's in Stegman Coliseum as the Georgia Bulldogs are on their way to a win against North Florida. We've got Cody Chaffins with us here too. Connor, let me start with you here. I thought tonight was going to be a pretty interesting test case for the committee in terms of how it treats Georgia. Now, listen, Georgia's biggest issue is it needs to win the games it's about to play. That we all understand that. And yet I still think within that framework, there's a discussion to be had about the way the playoff selection committee evaluates these teams. And I thought it'd be very interesting tonight to see how the committee treats Georgia in comparison to Miami. Georgia's ranked ahead of Miami in the Associated Press Top 25, but tonight the committee put Miami ahead of Georgia. Both teams lost this past weekend. Georgia, though, has played toughest schedule in the country according to the ESPN FPI strength of schedule metric. By comparison, Miami just 39th best. And ultimately, the committee did not see fit tonight anyway to reward Georgia for who it has played and, frankly, who it's beaten, instead seemingly looking to punish Georgia for the loss. I thought that was pretty telling. That doesn't mean that that's what's going to, kind of hold the day when it's all said and done. But for committee throughout the years, it talks a lot about really valuing, the strength of schedule and who you play and looking at resumes and things like that. I'm not convinced this committee could make a qualitative analysis between two teams if you gave them 6 months to do so. I think if you're a Georgia fan, you're probably more bothered by how your team played against Ole Miss. But I do think you've got some room to be frustrated by how this committee treated you tonight to the extent that these ratings matter at all. I'm not hearing Connor. Is that on me?
Try and get him back.
Yeah. Cody, jump in on that because, look, obviously the rankings don't matter all that much. All of this is just sort of made for TV top fodder. But if we're going to have them on TV, I think they deserve to have some logic behind them. And I didn't like the logic the committee used tonight, ranking Georgia as low as it did, lower than the AP poll had Georgia, and behind obviously several teams that Georgia would be pretty prodigious point spreads favorites were they to play against each other. What did you think about where Georgia came in?
Yeah, I think it's the same kind of thing we saw last year where Georgia they love to drop Georgia after a loss. We saw it, Georgia didn't make their way after the SEC championship game loss. Everybody loves to be super critical and drop Georgia out. And then you play this head-to-head game. If you were going just pure resume, the Ole Miss loss to Kentucky doesn't compare to Georgia going on the road in these really tough night environments. But I think a lot of it for Georgia right now is all the eyes have been on these Georgia games because they've played in such big spotlights, and the offense last week just sputtering along. Everybody was watching that game. And so now they're all experts because they know, this game gets picked apart maybe more than others just because of the spotlight Georgia gets.
Connor, how about you? Georgia treated too harshly by this committee tonight? I'm still not hearing Connor. So we'll see if we can get that figured out. Connor, you want to give another shot here? Yeah, I'm still not hearing Connor. So we'll see if we can get your audio taken care of. And if not, that's okay too. Look, here's why this matters. Because ultimately, you're talking about a glut of SEC teams that could all be 6-2. You're talking about obviously a far larger collection of SEC playoff contenders right now than you currently have in the Big Ten. You've got 3 teams currently in the rankings that haven't been a ranked team at all. Indiana, Penn State, and Texas. They've beaten no one, and yet they all had incredibly high rankings tonight on the basis of just their record alone without really any consideration for kind of who they've played or the overall quality of the team. Georgia would be about a 2-touchdown favorite over an undefeated BYU. It'd be, almost a touchdown favorite probably over Indiana. And yet these teams, just by virtue of having a pretty record, all got placed into that kind of top 12 that would give them that chance to be, at-large teams if this was the final ranking. So, once again, I do think the lack of deference paid to the Georgia strength of schedule could be telling for the decision-making process this committee may make later on. And it would have been nice. It would have been nice to see Georgia get some respect to that, not just because I'm a Georgia fan, but because it would have perhaps been, Cody, a key indicator that this committee is actually watching football and kind of paying attention to the resumes these teams are putting together beyond just their record, which since this thing began in 2014 is essentially all the committee's ever cared about.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think, everybody else just gets the benefit of the doubt that they haven't lost a game. And when you look at the Vegas, like you said, what the Vegas spreads would be, kind of like Kirby has said, nobody wants to play us, right? Even, Alabama and Ole Miss are in, but they're going to go on the road and be favorites. How does that make sense? That doesn't make sense if you're wanting to put the best teams. If you're ranking the best teams, then they should be favorited when they are hosting a game at their own place, and those teams won't be favorites.
You look at the bottom of the rankings for a moment, I thought it was certainly a boost to Alabama to see South Carolina come into the top 25 tonight, and that's also deserving for South Carolina too. But an Alabama team that comes in 10th in this ranking here tonight, seeded 10th anyway, in this rankings here tonight, getting another ranked win kind of added to their resume because of the entrance of South Carolina. I think that's a pretty big deal. That goes along with Missouri, who's kind of down there at the bottom part of the top 25 too. Georgia also getting a little bit of a boost in the fact that, Clemson this past weekend really doesn't get a lot of attention, but they went on the road to Virginia Tech. They sort of faced sort of a big storm at Blacksburg there to begin the game. There's a blocked field goal, things like that. And yet Clemson shook it off and found a way to win that game and moved up in the rankings because of that. So if you want to start looking at one of the things that this committee has talked about before, the number of ranked wins that you have, a ranked win for Georgia, Clemson moves up a little bit. Alabama does add another ranked win with South Carolina entering the rankings. So it's not too soon to start thinking about some of those things. And down there near the bottom of the top 25, Cody, I thought there was a couple of interesting resume additions, as I just described to you.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch. Colorado stuck out to me. Obviously, they get the chance now that they're kind of on this radar again, which we kind of wrote them off last year. And this is a team now that controls their own destiny, which could find their way into that Big 12 championship game against BYU. I know some folks, especially with the way BYU played last week, should have lost. That's a team that they think Colorado could be in there. So that's really interesting at the bottom of the rankings as well. But yeah, it's gonna be fun to watch. I just look at the way those rankings are, and you can see some of those now on the screen as we're getting those pulled up. But Georgia's still ahead of Texas A&M. Georgia's still ahead of LSU. Dropped way down too. But they got shellacked, right? So that's the thing. Georgia got beat, but it wasn't the same beating that LSU took.
One of the questions I would also have too is that when you look at the possibility that, there's at least some chance that Missouri, LSU, Texas A&M, Texas, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Ole Miss. The number of teams in the SEC that could finish with a 6-2 record, I believe, is 8 in total. And yet somehow this committee seems content to only sort of, I'm going to use, figurative language here, but only reserve about 4 playoff spots for the SEC, which is essentially the same number being kind of devoted to the Big Ten here right now. But as I said before, Indiana and Penn State don't have any ranked wins. They have a very good chance of finishing the year without a ranked win unless Indiana pulls the upset and beats Ohio State. So based on the way that the committee is setting this up right now, Penn State, they're ranked 4th this week. They're almost roller skating their way into the playoff without having beaten anybody. Indiana could lose to Ohio State and still, based on their record and based on where they're ranking right now, it becomes a little hard to imagine how they then move out. I guess the question I would ask is given the fact that the SEC overall has so many more playoff contending teams than the Big Ten does, is it really fair that both the Big Ten and the SEC might end up with the same number of playoff teams? Because I can make a case based on resumes, who's beating whom, and the quality of some of these wins. The SEC is perhaps deserving of at least 5 playoff teams, whereas the Big Ten may only be deserving of the 3. And you can decide between Penn State and Indiana about who the third's supposed to be. But until one of those two teams beats somebody of note, I'm not going to shed any tears for either one. I do think it's interesting that both the Big Ten and the SEC, at least based on these rankings, are kind of being allotted the same number of teams, and yet the overall quality of the leagues and kind of the top half of those conferences does not appear to be anything close to the same.
Yeah, Georgia why can't Georgia get a Maryland or get a Michigan State on there? You look at some of those teams that Indiana's playing or has to play, and yeah, they can lose one game to Ohio State. Now, I do think, there's going to be beauty points in their loss, right? Because we all assume they're going to lose to Ohio State. I think they do have to kind of keep that one close, but they're already, because like you said, where they already are, they're going to have, they're already got it built in, kind of, they can fall, a few more spots, but they're still locked in there to be one of those playoff teams. So I think that's going to be the thing. That's why it is so important right now that Penn State and Indiana are up there. It'll be interesting to see, somebody's going to lose the Big Ten championship game. Will that be treated the same as that SEC team, which gets a third loss in the SEC championship? If that is the case, are they going to be harsher to that SEC team than they are to that Big Ten team, saying, because that will only be their second loss? So that'll be interesting as well to see if it is all equal, because if it's not going to penalize you, then it shouldn't penalize you. But I do think, it's definitely, you can kind of see all those where those signs are pointing right now. I think ESPN really, really wants some snow games. I think that's part of it too.
Todd watching on X says it's simple though, BA, that if Georgia wins, they will be in. I believe that is likely true, that if Georgia goes 10-2 in the regular season, they are likely to make the college football playoff. But there's also an element of this discussion that kind of goes beyond Georgia just a bit, that the idea of all of the SEC teams that have a chance to be 10-2, they can't all say, well, as long as we keep winning, we're in. Somebody somewhere doesn't control their own destinies. Somebody somewhere is not in the SEC, I'm talking about, is not a, well, you just keep winning and you're in type of team. Somebody somewhere, that's not going to be true for them. Now, you may say, well, it's not going to be Georgia because they play the best strength of schedule. The point we're getting to, though, is if that's going to be true eventually, it's at least interesting to know that there is no nod to Georgia's strength of schedule here tonight. So I do believe that if Georgia keeps winning, it'll be in the college football playoff. But it's just mathematically true that there very likely could be a 10-2 SEC team that doesn't make the college football playoff because of the nature of the expanded conference. There could just be more 10-2 teams in this league than the college football playoff selection committee seems to want to allot playoff spots too. That it may be true for Georgia, they get in, but it's also possible that somebody in the SEC could be 10-2 and not get in based on some of the conversations that are taking place here right now.
And it's going to be one of those teams who doesn't get in, who again would be favored if they were going to Bloomington, right? Like let's keep that in mind. I will be interested to see if Texas gets the loss, if they lose to Texas A&M, how far they would drop, because they're getting so much love right now as well without having that signature win. So that'll be something as we move forward, and that would really create the log jam. And they're going to be one of those teams. Well, they were already up there, so they aren't going to fall too far. Well, hold on. They were up there just because of their record. They weren't up there because of their wins. So once they get grouped in with everybody, is there a possibility they're the team that's left out because their strength of schedule won't be any good? It's hard because they're already ranked up so high, and you feel like they're not going to kick them down. They do like to kick Georgia down, but they don't like to kick everybody down like that.
So let me restate here. To me, the biggest news of the day from this ranking, it obviously impacts Georgia, but I think it's more than just that. The fact that Miami stays in the top 10 at number 9, the presence of Miami there is enough to sort of move Georgia out of the at-large field, because a team not ranked in the top 12, Boise State, would be in the field because they're theoretically a conference champion here. In other words, Miami, a little bit like Boise State, they would still be in the playoff and still be one of the top 4 seats no matter what they're ranked. They could be ranked, 12th, 13th like they are in the AP poll and still be in the field because of the fact they're going to be, at least in this theoretical operation here, the ACC conference champ. But they didn't get that. They got the higher ranking than Georgia. They got to be in at 9. Not the same viewpoint that the Associated Press top 25 took on those two teams here this week. So a good bit of respect for Miami team after losing to Georgia Tech on Saturday and some close calls earlier in the season, obviously aided by, at least in the minds of many officials, in the game against Virginia Tech and the game against Cal. And yet, that team got the nod inside the top 10. And BYU now all the way up to 6 after a couple of losses for other teams, and including Georgia that was highly ranked last week. A lot of respect, Cody, here for these leagues, ACC and Big 12, that we think may only be one bid leagues, but right now the highest rated teams, highest ranked teams from those two conferences both find their way in the top 10 here right now.
Yeah, Miami goes down 5 spots after losing to Georgia Tech. Georgia goes down 9 spots after losing to a ranked Ole Miss team. So one of these things is not like the other. But again, I think obviously they're going to keep Miami there, assuming that they're going to be the ACC champion. ACC is still going to get just their one team, at least the way it looks right now. So, it's not too much to worry about. Whether it's BYU or Colorado, whether it's SMU or Miami, those teams just – because the way this playoff is set up, they get to have their thing. And Georgia, it's a playoff game this weekend, and Kirby Smart doesn't want to say it, but it is. And Georgia, that's the thing, is you can be frustrated, and we are frustrated, but it's also, you got to play much better, and you get your chance. You just got to play it. You play your way in for 4 weeks now before you actually get in.
And part of this, we get ready to wrap up, is just sort of the sport of arguing about this, something we've enjoyed doing now for a good number of years. So ultimately, Georgia's biggest issue is, as you said, they need to play better than they did against Ole Miss this past Saturday and find a way to go on a winning streak to end the season. That's the biggest directive for Georgia. My question with the committee, though, is if at some point in time Georgia's strength of schedule is going to matter, and I believe that it should, when does that conversation start? Because it does not seem to be happening here tonight. A committee that doesn't seem to operate with very consistent logic week to week, kind of perhaps guilty of that here once again. So I think the issue is out in front of Georgia. Beat Tennessee, find a way to get in 10-2. You have a very, very strong case as one of the teams that deserves an at-large bid, whether it's a home game or not. That'll be a different discussion for a different day. You would have a very strong case for an at-large bid. But based on these rankings and how they played out here through 2 weeks, Cody, for me, whether it be Georgia or some of the other teams to be mentioned here, the SEC, I don't believe, is getting enough respect for a league that has a lot more total true playoff contenders than the Big Ten and certainly the ACC or the Big 12. That's sort of my big takeaway here right now.
Yeah, and it's all made for TV, right? Like, let's not forget that. And they want, they're going to, like we've said with the 14, they're going to want to put teams in from all over these places to make sure their first one, especially if I'm telling you, they are drooling thinking, oh, it could be snowing at Penn State. Yeah. And what a game how cool would it look? And it's not, that's part of it. Let's not, act like that's not part of it. That is part of it. And I think, it's one of those things that just comes with the territory. It's a 12-team playoff, which is better than 4, you still control your own destiny, but you better believe, there's some people with a lot of money on the line for this thing, and they want it to succeed.
Yeah, interesting to watch all this play out. Of course, we'll be doing more of this tomorrow morning on DawgNation Daily, and obviously Cody's going to have plenty of thoughts there for you too. We'll have a lot of video stuff too as we move towards the Tennessee game coming up on Saturday. So a lot of fun stuff going on. Sorry, Connor Riley could not be with us tonight. He was there live with the Georgia Bulldogs at Stegman Coliseum. But the bottom line is Georgia comes in at number 12. That's their ranking. But their seed in this case would actually be 13th because the team that's ranked behind them, Boise State, would move up because they would be a conference champion and therefore is the highest rated group of 5 team in the college football playoff as the 12th seed, a part of this complicated formula that is playing out here in 2024. But that's the story. Georgia, at least tonight, in the college football playoff rankings, on the outside looking in, ranked number 12, lower than they were in the AP poll, and at least for now, outside the college football playoff, unless Georgia gets back to its winning ways starting this Saturday against Tennessee. By the way, interesting news coming out of Knoxville here today, where it looks like Vols quarterback Nico Iamaleava is going through what's been described as concussion protocol. His status for Saturday up in the air. More details coming out about that, too. We'll keep our eyes on that as well. But for tonight, for Cody Chaffins and Jay Black, who's helped keep us on the air tonight, and Connor Riley, who made a game attempt to be a part of the show. We'll say goodnight to you here. College football rankings for week 2 of the rankings are in the book. By the way, we didn't even mention the top here where Oregon and Ohio State hold on to the top 2 spots. We mentioned Texas moving up to number 3, Penn State moving up to number 4, but it's Georgia at number 12 in the rankings, 13 in the seedings, and plenty of conversation to be had about that. Have a great night, everybody. We'll see you back here next week, earlier back to our normal time slot after these rankings are released there, and perhaps Georgia moving up, we hope,